I was born in Kingsport, 1926. Dad came over here in 1916, before the city was organized. I think it was organized, and certainly Kingsport was here, to work at what was called then the old big store. And it was later J. Fred Johnson and Company, and he came over here to work for Mr. Johnson in the big store. He worked there for 44 years and left as a partner. Some of the things that he used to tell me about the fun things they had, because it was such a small town, there was nothing to do but entertain each other. So they, one of the first things I remember him telling me about, Dr. Tipton, who was one of the original doctors here in Kingsport, a general practitioner. And he used to run down the stairs. They had no hospital, of course, and he would run down the stairs when they had an emergency and jump in his car and go tearing off down Broad Street. And so the guys, some of his buddies, changed the back bumper of the back axle of his car one day to a fire hydrant or a tree. There were trees up and down Broad Street then. And he came running down the stairs, jumped in his car, and took off down Broad Street and jerked the axle back out from under his car. So by starting that kind of thing, they started doing it to each other. And as a little boy, I can remember Mr. Edwards, who had an insurance company, Bennett and Edwards, here in Kingsport. We went on vacation one time, and we lived next door to each other, and he came over and put a hose in the basement and stopped up the drain and filled our basement up with water. So as retaliation, when Daddy got back, of course, the fire chief and the police department, they were all just buddies. He called the fire department and had Mr. Roy Pyle called Mr. Edwards and told him his house was on fire. And so they sent the fire truck up to his house, and they scared him to death. One, of course, he could have killed somebody trying to get home to get his family out of the house. And they were all sitting in the living room waiting on him up there, including the fire chief. So they did things like that all the time for entertainment. The big thing in Kingsport was religion, and going back to that time, my mother and Daddy Daddy was a charter member of the First Presbyterian Church in Kingsport. And the first church, they started out meeting in the old Strand Theater. And then the building between, if you've seen an old picture of Kingsport, building between the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church was the first high school in Kingsport. And when they built Dobbins Bennett High School, we got that building, and that's where I went to Sunday school and church when I was first just a little boy, before we built our church there in the middle on the church circle. My dad had a Sunday school class there all through the years, and when the war started, he had over 100 men. I would love to say that it was all Daddy, and it was not all Daddy. He was a wonderful Sunday school teacher, but it became kind of the social center. And back then, there were tons of single men in Kingsport, and you can just almost go down any street in Kingsport and say, well, they met at Eastman. And so he had over 100 men in his Sunday school class when the war started, and they loved to meet there, and it was a common saying out at Eastman, said, I'll see you Sunday. We had a carnival here every year, the American Legion Carnival, which was probably the big social thing of the year. They had the women of the auxiliary, the wives of the men who had served in the First World War, had an auxiliary, and that was kind of the ladies' center for Kingsport. I remember they had a bandstand as a little boy downtown, and that was down where the old Penny's was when it was down on Broad Street. That whole block was vacant. And they had a bandstand down there, and they had band concerts, usually on Friday or Saturday. The Kingsport had the same knocks everybody else had, but I think the mainstay here, as I stated in the beginning, has always been Eastman, and that culture out there has always been so great, and they hired that kind of people. They hired fine Christian men. And so that culture, I think, really was behind making Kingsport what it is today, besides what I said in the beginning of Mr. Johnson being such a fine Christian man, and good people get good people. So it's all my life. That's all I ever remember, is having that kind of that kind of city culture. There was never any bad parts in Kingsport. We had the same recessions everybody else had, the same depression. But Eastman was kind of a stabilizer through all those. And then as these other plants came on board, you know, Holliston Mills and the Kingsport Press and Borden Mills and the Mead Corporation came here, we became an industrial town. Overall, Kingsport, because of the stabilization of industry, has been a real good place to do business. There's never been a time when you ever came close to going under unless there was some kind of, and of course the fact that Eastman has been a stable employer too. They've always treated their people with so much respect that it's been a good working environment. So, and that trickles down, of course, to your own people. Of course, I love Kingsport, so I've loved living here. I wouldn't have stayed all these years, but I don't know of any place. I've never been anywhere in the world, and we've been all over the world. Been very fortunate to travel a lot. That any better place to live than Kingsport. So I think we've got a tremendous future in front of us because Eastman's booming, and everybody's always said the way Eastman goes, the way Kingsport goes. Well, you couldn't have gone any better than in that direction with the type of management that they've had out there through the years.